Welcome to this presentation on the topic of utility and the demand by individuals. It satisfies the requirements of UK stream A-level courses and also of US stream advanced placement. The learning outcomes are stated in the contents page of the presentation. We're going to try to relate the theory of utility to the demand for products by individuals, and then we're going to look at how a price change can cause a change in the quantity demanded using the theory of marginal utility. We're going to derive the formula that underlies the equimarginal principle. We're then going to aggregate the individual demand curves into a market demand curve, and finally assess the usefulness of marginal utility theory for those long essay questions. The law of demand states that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Hence, of course, we have the negative correlation between the price and quantity demanded. A fall in the price down here will lead to an increase in the quantity demanded. The question is why? Well, this inverse relationship between price and demand occurs at the level of an individual. Consider the fall in price of a cheese sandwich, chicken sandwich, a glass of milk, glass of coffee. You're going to have an increase in the quantity demanded in most cases. We're going to delve now in more detail to look at those particular causes. Imagine a nice, cool, refreshing glass of cold brew coffee with a few chunks of ice in there. Looks absolutely appetizing. And I can assure you, at least if you're a coffee drinker like myself, that the marginal utility you get from that first cup is going to be positive and very high. The concept of utility is used to illustrate pleasure, satisfaction, delight that one gets from consuming products. Consumers will try to maximize their total utility. In other words, their total pleasure from consumption. Their objective is utility maximization, just as the objective of firms is profit maximization. So it's quite kind of symmetrical. We economists assume that consumers in general want to consume more, not less, though of course we then have to learn something very important about how much we need to consume. Imagine you've had a hard day at school and college, you had some pretty heavy lectures in microeconomics, and it's time to get out, escape, and have a nice cup of iced coffee. You get immense pleasure from that first cup. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you can actually measure the amount of pleasure you get from it. Let's call the unit of measurement utils, and let's assume that you get 5 utils from that first cup. Okay, that means that your marginal utility on the first cup is equal to 5 utils, as shown in the column chart down there. You now finish your first cup. That was amazingly nice, and you're thinking now about having a second cup. It was so good, but of course the extra pleasure or satisfaction you get from that second cup is going to be a bit less. It might be down to 4 utils. It could be even less. Let's assume it's 4 utils. So the second cup has a marginal utility of 4. That means the combined utility, the total utility from the first 2 cups, is going to be what? I'll give you a second or two to think of the answer before I call it out. Okay, the total utility can be got by adding the marginal utility from the first 2 cups, which will be 9. Okay, right now it's important to understand that the extra satisfaction, the marginal utility from that second cup, is less than the first one, because mostly we consumers experience diminishing marginal utility, an absolutely critical concept, just as firms in the short term with some fixed factors experience diminishing marginal returns. At high levels of consumption, utility might increase, but by less than, for example, the previous consumption unit. Okay, so high marginal utility on that first cup, not surprisingly. The second cup is going to give less marginal utility. A third cup, if you can take that, will give you even less. And the fourth one I don't advise for health reasons. If each one has a double shot, may even give you a negative marginal utility. Could cause you some negative health impact there. Okay. This theory of marginal utility helps us to get around a what's called the paradox of value, as put forward by the famous Scottish economist, classical economist Adam Smith. We tend to get more utility from necessary products such as water, for example, or bread, than luxury items like diamonds. But why are we prepared to pay a high price for diamonds and not bread? This is called the paradox of value, and just looking at total utility does not really help us to understand why bread commands a low price whereas diamonds command a very high price, even though the former, bread, is more useful to the human race than diamonds. And I doubt if many will disagree with me. This theory of marginal utility will help us to explain that, and that's coming up in the next few slides. We're also going to look at interesting questions like, when do we stop buying more bread or consuming more bread? When do we stop consuming or buying more diamonds and gold? Why did we choose to go on a vacation abroad rather than buying a new laptop that we need for our work? Well, microeconomists try to explain this using the theory of utility, marginal utility. We're going to assume two goods, chicken sandwiches and chips. If you're hungry, have a bit to eat before you look at this presentation. We're going to consider a consumer called Jane. She's quite hungry, as you can guess, so let's read on. Well, Jane reckons she enjoys the following satisfaction measured in utils. It's kind of subjective, right? So Jane may have a different opinion the next day. She might have a sleep and have a different measure of marginal utility. She might see an advert of a chicken sandwich and have higher marginal utility. It is all subjective, and that's why I suggested that she reckons. She can't really be sure, and that's one limitation of the whole theory, as we're going to see. Let's assume now that Jane has some idea. Okay, she reckons that a chicken sandwich is going to give her marginal utility of 10 utils, whereas a plate of chips will give a marginal utility of 6 utils. Her dilemma now is, okay, do I go for the chicken sandwich? Do I go for the chips? What else do we assume? We assume that she has a fixed budget, and she's going to pretty much spend, I guess, the whole budget on her consumption, and she does care about the price of each good. Let's see the next few slides now to see what goes on in her mindset. How does she make that decision using the theory of marginal utility? Well, in economics we assume that she considers two things: the extra satisfaction, okay, and that's marginal utility as seen in the previous slide. The same values, 10 and 6, okay? We assume now that the chicken sandwich has a price of $5. Might be a fairly decent chicken sandwich. And a plate of chips, French fries in America, will cost her $2 American dollars. Now, we don't assume that she will simply buy the chicken sandwich because it gives her more utility. She's considering the amount of extra utility, the amount of extra pleasure or satisfaction she gets for every dollar spent, and that's where the price issue comes in. If you consider here, she's getting 10 extra utils for a price of $5. That means for every $1 she's spending on the chicken sandwich, she's deriving on average 2 utils, and therefore we construct an extra set of data here in the final column. the extra utility per dollar spent. And here it's going to be 2. Let's just repeat that. We take the marginal utility, we divide by the price, and we get the amount of extra satisfaction she gets from every single dollar spent on the chicken sandwich. And that works out to be 2 utils per dollar in the case of the sandwich. What about the case of the chips? Again, same procedure. Divide your extra satisfaction, which is 6, by the price, and you get the extra satisfaction per dollar spent on the chips, which will be 3. And now we kind of almost reverse the result, that she's going to get more pleasure per dollar spent on the chips than the chicken sandwich. Maybe she's already had one chicken sandwich and she needs a complementary product to go with it. Okay, let's look at the key concept for this particular slide. Consumers maximize total utility by considering the extra or marginal utility derived from spending $1 more on a range of different products and services. Based upon that kind of equation, people like Jane, us consumers, will make a decision about what to buy more of and what to buy less of. Let's move on to the next slide to get further clarification of that. Okay, let's say she decided now to buy the bag of chips because it gave her more utility, more additional utility per dollar spent. She now has another decision. Does she buy another bag of chips, another plate of chips, or does she buy another sandwich? Remember, she's going to experience diminishing marginal utility. Chips or no chips, French fries or no French fries. So we assume now that her marginal utility on an additional plate of chips is no longer going to be 6. We assume now it goes down to 4. The price is still the same. There's no discount for an additional plate. So now her marginal utility per dollar spent will be 4 divided by $2, which gives a result of 2 utils per dollar. Notice that that is now the same as the utils per dollar spent on the chicken sandwich, and therefore we assume that she's pretty much in equilibrium, okay, that she made the right choice. She's going to pretty much stop there because now she has the same extra utility per dollar spent on both products. So her consumption bundle is in equilibrium, and this is what we call the equimarginal principle. Okay, the equimarginal principle. She has a couple of choices, I guess, now. Okay, let's just get the next animation in down here. Let's repeat that in word format so you actually get an idea. Then we're going to see the formula for this, so you combine the formula with the text. And you need, in examinations, to be able to repeat both, to write out formulae very clearly, and also to state those formula in a very clear text format as part of essays. Consumers maximize total utility, not marginal utility. How do they do that? They consume the bundle of goods, in other words, a combination of chips and chicken sandwiches, by equating the extra utility per dollar spent on each item. Jane is delighted. She then forgot her microeconomics and focused on enjoying her lunch. How do we express that in the formula method? The marginal utility for chips divided by the price, that's the extra satisfaction per dollar spent, for chips should equal the same for sandwiches, and the same for tea, and the same for coffee, and so on, and even should equal the marginal utility of holding money. Now in this case, for example, she derives 2 utils per dollar in the case of chicken sandwiches and chips. Now if, for example, she got extra satisfaction of holding money of only 1 util per dollar, in other words, holding $1 of cash were to give her 1 util of pleasure, she should actually buy more chicken sandwiches and more chips, because the value to her of more food is more than the value of holding the money. So the equimarginal principle states that the marginal utility per dollar spent on each product should be equal, and that in turn should equal the marginal utility of holding money as judged by this particular consumer, Jane. Okay? This is really the crux of the matter, and I think, you know, if you are going to have to revise any parts of this particular section of the course, then I think this is a slide that you've got to come back to and be able to reproduce in the form of the formula down here, okay, and also in textual form for essays. Okay, of course, for multiple choice questions, I think this formula is going to be particularly useful. So make sure that you practice past papers, whether you're doing advanced placement or A-levels, and you can actually use this formula in multiple choice questions. I have one or two questions at the end of this particular presentation, but if you want the full set of multiple choice questions from me, I have a learning management system, and you can send an email to me for access to that. Okay, let's move on a bit now. We're coming towards the climax of the presentation, and I'm sure you're pleased about that. Let's assume now that we have a price change in one of the products. That's going to mess up the equimarginal principle, and it's going to put Jane in a quandary. She's now in disequilibrium. What's happened here is that for some reason her favorite chicken place has decided to slash prices from $5 to $2, and of course that's going to dramatically alter her judgments now. Her marginal utility of a sandwich has gone back to its original value 10. It's a new day, new situation, and her now marginal utility per dollar spent is going to be 10 divided by 2, not 10 divided by $5, and that's going to give her 5 utils of pleasure per dollar spent. Of course, compared to chips now, it's far higher. And that just states in text form what I've just said now, nothing new there. There's the formula. Look what's happened here. The marginal utility on a sandwich, S for sandwich, per dollar spent, is now higher than the marginal utility per dollar spent on the chips. So she's now in disequilibrium. If we now think about the equimarginal principle, there's basically only one, maybe two options that she has. Think about the diminishing marginal utility concept. That means the more sandwiches she consumes, this marginal utility is actually going to fall. And that's what Jane needs to do to get back into equilibrium. Remember, the price fell. This is now much higher than the corresponding value for chips. But if she actually goes back here and consumes more chicken sandwiches, her marginal utility will start to fall because of diminishing marginal utility. There are only so many delicious chicken sandwiches that Jane can eat. So the MU now is going to start to fall. Let's assume it goes down to 4, having had her extra sandwich. Okay, and now 4 divided by 2 will give you 2 again, and she's back in equilibrium over here. Okay, so as Jane consumes another sandwich, her marginal utility falls to 4. MU divided by price goes back to 4 utils per dollar spent. Her consumption bundle is back in equilibrium. What actually happened? Let's just summarize from beginning to end. As the price of sandwiches fell, Jane consumed more. That's the typical result we get from the negative correlation of a demand curve, and we've explained it now in more complex and perhaps more realistic terms using the theory of marginal utility. In reality, there are lots of people like Jane. There's me, all of you guys who are watching this presentation, plus Jane, plus others. There are lots of individuals. Every consumer has a different or subjective evaluation of the marginal utility of a plate of chips or a chicken sandwiches. Jane's marginal utility, for example, might change as her income changes. As she gets more and more income, the sandwich bar that she used to go to may no longer satisfy her, and it may have lower marginal utility, and therefore that equation again is no longer going to be valid. So she consumed less. It may also rise due to advertising. Advertising makes us feel good about consuming certain products, focusing more perhaps on intangible features like branding. And therefore that will encourage us to consume more of a product. We consume more, and the NU would then fall again and bring us back into equilibrium. So we have lots of questions now about individuals. If the price were X dollars, for example, let's say P1, what would Jane's demand be based upon a price of P1? It'll be Q1 for Jane. What about a guy called John? Well, at that same price, John demands Q1 for John. If we now add together the Q1 for Jane, okay, with the Q1 for John, we're going to get a combined figure which will then go into the market demand curve. So at P1, the market demand here will equal the demand by Jane plus the demand by John, and that will give us a new figure down here, which is the aggregation of the individual demands by consumers at P1. We can then repeat the same process at a second price, a lower price, and see what Jane's demand was, what John's demand was, add them together, and we get the market demand curve at, or the market demand level at price P2. If we then add together all the different quantities demanded at the market level for each and every price, we're going to construct a demand schedule, and that can be easily converted, of course, into a market demand curve, such as we have over here. So the market demand is a sum of individual demand curves at each and every price. Now, often I have noticed in an exam papers that examiners will tend to ask about the application of utility theory to market demand, and I think a lot of students focus only upon individual demand curves, focusing on people like Jane, for example. Yes, you have to do that. You have to go through the theory of utility and apply it to individuals like Jane, but then you need the theory embodied in this particular slide to aggregate the demand by individuals into a market demand to fully satisfy the requirements of those particular essay questions. So please be careful about that. We're now into the penultimate slide. Sometimes there are long essay questions about the usefulness of marginal utility analysis. This might come more into the UK stream examinations, as they tend to like longer essays and place more weight upon those kind of questions than the American stream, but I think still applicable to both. This slide divides the benefits of marginal utility theory into two parts here, the usefulness and the limitations. As far as the usefulness is concerned, we mentioned earlier that it's kind of symmetrical to the part of the theory of the firm dealing with diminishing marginal returns with at least one fixed factor, and that kind of symmetry is very helpful in consistently applying economic theory and realizing that consumers do share something in common with firms. They are out to maximize something, let's say profits in the case of firms and utility in the case of consumers, and it provides a theoretical foundation for how consumers actually go about maximizing their utility, just as we have in the case of the firm. They maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So consumers maximize utility by, think of the answer quickly before I give it to you. Excuse me. By almost unconsciously following the theory, the equimarginal principle, equating the marginal utility per dollar spent across all products and across the value of holding money. Secondly, it helps to explain the paradox of value. Remember, diamonds command a higher price than bread, though bread in a sense provides more total utility. You can live on bread alone, but not diamonds. The marginal utility theory does help to explain the paradox, because what it states is that consumers equate the marginal utility per dollar spent across all products. Diamonds do give higher marginal utility than bread, but of course scarcity makes the price far higher. So you can have an equilibrium between bread and diamonds, in the sense that consumers will consume a lot more bread than diamonds, satisfying what we know in reality. Diamonds are far more scarce and therefore command a higher price, and therefore the consumption is lower. If we look at the limitations of the theory, however, there are quite a few here, and the theory has been critiqued rather severely in the literature for several reasons. Firstly, you have guessed, we assume Jane could estimate her marginal utility in terms of utils, but of course it's very subjective, and it's really impossible to establish an objective means by which we can measure marginal utility. And even if we could do, it'll vary a lot across consumers for the same product, and even more critically, for the same consumer at different parts of the day, and so on. We also looked at marginal utility for individual products. We looked at the marginal utility of a glass of delicious cold brew coffee and of a chicken sandwich. But in reality, most products are consumed in conjunction with other products or as alternatives for them. And therefore, for example, the marginal utility of a chicken sandwich by itself may be a lot lower than in conjunction with a plate of chips and a glass of cold juice. So again, the theory as stated so far in this presentation is rather simplistic. To be closer to reality, it'll have to be a lot more complex and consider the marginal utility of groups of products, if you like, allowing for complementarity. Thirdly, we assume that every product experiences diminishing marginal utility for its consumers. Yes, okay, within a limited time period, that's true. You're not going to have 4 cups of coffee in 10 minutes. However, looked at over a longer period of time, consumers do not always experience such diminishing marginal utility. In fact, quite the opposite. There are many products, coffee included, which can grow upon a person. The first time a person has coffee, it might taste rather bitter, but after a few cups of nice Americano or various types of frappe, coffee can seriously grow upon people and become a kind of habit, like tea, and therefore over a period of time, rather than diminishing marginal utility, it's almost the opposite. Lastly, consumers of course are assumed to have fixed incomes and fixed values of utils per dollar of holding money in the theory. Otherwise we can't make that equimarginal principle statement. But again, that's very static. They both change as economies grow. And as discussed earlier, for example, when Jane's income increases, the marginal utility she gets from that chicken sandwich might seriously fall as she thinks about alternative products that satisfy her higher income status. There's also another limitation, not in the slide here, about divisibilities or indivisibilities. The theory assumes that you can somehow keep on consuming more or less of certain products to bring you back into equilibrium according to the equimarginal principle. That applies well with cheaper products where you can have another glass of Pepsi or Coke, you can have another glass of milk, for example, but you can't always just rush out and buy a new Lamborghini or buy a new house or sell a house in a kind of continuous, non-discrete fashion. So the theory tends to kind of not allow adequately for that. The final slide kind of wraps up now. What have we learnt in this presentation? Well, we learnt that according to typical demand theory, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Looking at the graph here, for example, what's the maximum now that Jane is prepared to pay for Q1? Okay, she's prepared to pay a maximum of P1. To persuade Jane to actually consume another unit of that product, in other words, to jump from Q1 to Q2, you have to lower the price because she's not prepared to pay P1 up here for Q2. She's prepared to pay P1 only for the first unit. So this negative slope of the demand curve allows for the diminishing marginal utility that Jane experiences, and that explains why some coffee shops, for example, offer a cheaper a second cup. They offer a refill and have a special refill price because they know that there's diminishing marginal utility. I wish my local coffee shop offered me the same thing, but they don't. Okay, we also learned that you aggregate across all individual demand curves to construct the market demand curve, and that's an important part of answering essay questions. I think you've listened to a lot of theory now. You probably have to replay this once or twice to fully understand all the issues. I hope that it's made clear. We have another presentation coming up on utility, and that looks at the concept of budgets and takes you a step further to look at indifference curves and a slightly more complex application of the theory. I look forward to our next session together. Thank you all very much.